Okay, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Ikaw,
Good evening, sir.
Good evening, sir.
good evening. Di ka pa nagpapaahit, Mr. Lubangko? Ha? Pwede naman eh. Basta naka-face mask ka. But then, kita nakilala ka agad kanina. Alright, so let's proceed. So, kompleto tayo. Very good. So you've all gotten your assignments back. It's about land use and the like, and that will be our subject matter for tonight. Okay, so just a minute. Let's start with land use. Okay. Okay, so land use okay, refers to the allocation of land for various economic activities. Okay, where the word for the economic activities would be use. Okay, and human beings have a lot of economic activities, and these activities all have to happen on land because human beings are landlubbers. Okay? Hindi tayo si Ariel o si Jezebel, hindi tayo taga-dagat, hindi tayo mga taga-tubig, taga-lupa tayo. And there's only so much land available in particular locations. So in order to understand why a particular area has these sorts of land use or land uses, okay, we will have to consider here essentially the demand for land. And demand for land would mean that there's a supply of land. And therefore, whenever there's supply and demand, there is a price. Okay? And the price usually is represented by what is called land rent. Okay? Now, when you say land rent here refers to the payment for the right to use land. That's the price for the use of land. And the market value of land would be the present value of the stream of rental income. Okay. Now, the theory of rent has its origins in the essay of David Ricardo back from 1815. His essay on the mahahaba ang mga titles noon. So I'm trying to remember exactly the wording. An essay on the, well, it's usually called the essay on profits, but it's a very, very long title. It has to do with the profits of land and the rent on land. Okay. Now, the paper by David Ricardo, for those of you who took up history of economic thought, and I hope you got a chance to read it, was actually the first systematic method in economic analysis of using what we would call abstract method of analysis. Okay? Before this paper of Ricardo, most of the argumentation in economics was discursive, like Adam Smith, David Hume, or Thomas Malthus would often cite historical events and their daily observations in order to explain a particular argument that they are putting forth, whether it be the determinants of a price of a good or the causes of inflation and the like. Okay? But in the case of Ricardo's essay, I think it was essay on rent and its effect on the profits of stock, something like that. Okay, it's this particular essay that first presented the argument using abstract analysis. Okay, and in this analysis, he said that land with a higher fertility and a good location would have a lower production cost for a farmer, and therefore this would result in higher rent. The second quality land, okay, would not command rent as high as the first quality land. Okay, and therefore the rent on the first quality land will be much greater the more lesser and lesser quality land and the more distant land becomes utilized for farming. Although the analysis used farmland as an example, the rent theory has now been extended insofar as urban land is concerned to now refer to not so much land with higher fertility, but land with greater accessibility. It's what's known in real estate as location, location, location. Okay, so the land which is most centrally located insofar as business activities are concerned, would have the lower transport costs and they will therefore command higher rent. And the demand for land, as argued by Ricardo and is now established in the theory of rent, that the demand for land is derived from the demand for output. Land is expensive because of its usefulness, because of what uses it can provide, not because of its own inherent qualities, like fertility, soil quality, and the like. Now, in this case, given that land rent is highest whenever it's more centrally located, as it turns out, there are actually many different urban forms. Okay, the polar opposites would be a monocentric city, one city with just only one well-defined center, okay, largely core dominated, and the opposite pole, a multicentric city, one city that's so highly suburbanized that there are many suburban or many central business districts. Here is one such example. Okay. The sector theory of urban spatial structure adapted from Chapin and Kaiser. Well, you have here the central business district. Then there's the wholesale and light manufacturing. Notice that in terms of location, wholesale and light manufacturing establishments actually can be located even up to the periphery. Okay? Because if you recall our discussion last week, okay, you would have in cities a lot of market-based firms which have to locate close to their markets, but also you would have what are known as footloose industries for whom the cost of their inputs more or less equal the cost of their outputs, so they will locate at the median where the cost of transporting their input is more or less equal to the cost of transporting their output, which is why some footloose industries may not necessarily locate near the center, but they would still be locating at the periphery with access to the main city. Then you would have your low-class residential area. In the low-class residential area, very many would like to locate close to the city center because they cannot afford a high transport cost. So if they could, they will locate in the city center. Okay? They might be able to afford to stay in rent-controlled apartments, or they might be settling in informal settlements. Now, the middle and the high-class residential areas are located a bit of a distance from the central business district. because those with higher incomes can afford the daily transport cost, and they might like to locate a bit of the distance from the city center so that they can afford to live in larger lots. Okay? They can afford to live in houses with larger lots and therefore give them the semblance of living, not in the center of the city, but with the amenities of what the English-speaking peoples would call country living. Country living is, kumbaga sa ating mga Pilipino, yung buhay sa probinsya. Meaning to say, you have a house with a garden around it and a bit of a distance from your neighbors. Country among the British is yun, sa probinsya. So that's the country, and then the town. The town would be the cities. So by living in the suburbs, it is living not too far away from the city center, but you're living in a circumstance that allows you to try and replicate something of country life, in that you have a house and you have your own lot with a garden around your house. Okay. Now, a polycentric region would look like this, where there is no well-defined center, as opposed to a centric region where there is a well-defined center. Metro Manila looks more like a polycentric city because there is no one well-defined central business district. Meron tayong Makati, then there's BGC, you have Ortigas, and then you have satellite centers like to the north of BGC, you have the spots of Quezon City, like Cubao, then the Trinoma SM North development going all the way to the Fairview area. Then to the south, you have Alabang. Okay. Now, a centric region is a region where there is a dominant city dominating the entire region. Okay? You have some cities which have a well-defined center, like New York, it's largely Manhattan. Paris, it's the old city of Paris. Okay? London, it's city of London, city of Westminster. Center is well-defined. There's only one major center. But this model can also be applied to an entire large region. Okay? Metro Manila, as I mentioned to you, the city itself, the Metro Manila city itself may be polycentric. But in terms of the entire economic region around it, you can say that Metro Manila is the centric one. And then you have some satellite cities around it. Okay? Like you have Malolos to the north, and to a degree, San Jose del Monte. To the south, you would have Santa Rosa, Calamba, Dasmariñas. Okay. Now, there isn't a well-defined center to the east of Metro Manila. And I would argue that's because there isn't any expressway going in that direction. There's an expressway going north and an expressway going south, which has made the travel from the north and the south towards Metro Manila much more convenient for the past 40 years that these expressways have been available. There isn't any expressway to the east. So there isn't any major city center that developed to the east of Metro Manila, since there is no expressway link. Okay. Now, when we look at land use now, there are many ways of approaching the issue of land use. Okay? Land use can be defined in terms of whether the use is single use or mixed use. Okay? It can also be defined in terms of density. And land use can also be deliberately realized through a pattern called zoning. Dun sa mga assignments ninyo, the ones that you've submitted would be what your cities have established as the actual land use. Okay? And they also have what is called a proposed land use. Okay? Tapos may color coding pa. And you'll notice that the color codes simply identify the land use. And in a few cases, they will say medium density, high density, low density. Okay. And then they'll say that some places are dominantly commercial, but mixed use. Okay. Iba, clearly residential or so. One thing I notice about all your assignments, I don't know if you can see each other's assignments, but I hope you can. But it's always very educational to get to see the discussions and analysis of the different cities here in the Philippines. But one thing that's common to all the land use maps, with the exception, of course, of Butuan, is that in all your cities from Bacoor, Quezon City, Taguig, Pasig, someone also sent in Manila and the like, okay? There isn't much land set aside as open space or a public park. If there is a large green area, chances are it is a private um, open space. Like doon sa Mandaluyong, there's a large green area, which is actually the Wakwak Golf and Country Club. Sa Quezon City, the one large area is the La Mesa Dam, watershed and reservoir area. Okay, but that is walled off. Okay, that's to prevent the formation of squatters in the watershed area. Okay, and there isn't any other large park in Metro Manila. The Quezon Memorial Circle is very small. But anyway, so that's one of the things I notice about the land use maps that we have from all the different cities here in Metro Manila. There isn't much of an appreciation of the importance of having open space of public parks, the like. Okay? Here's a photo, okay, where you can see the contrast in the land use. The buildings here would be Alabang of about 7 years ago. And then over here, this heavily wooded area is a residential area. Okay. Many would argue that there's actually a lot of spaces with trees in Metro Manila. And this is the example. All these trees in this particular residential area. And as you can see, it's very wide. It occupies a huge area and there are lots of trees, lots of greenery. However, the thing is, all of these spaces are actually private. They all belong to private gardens. They are not to be enjoyed by residents in general. This entire area remains as a largely single-use residential area. Meanwhile, if you look at the buildings in the distance, these are all high density. Okay, high density would mean that there's several floors. Dito sa Pilipinas, medium density, if I recall right, low density is up to 2 floors. Okay, medium density is up to 5 floors. Okay, higher than that is high density. So in other places, in other cities, density is a function of the actual height, not the number of floors, but the actual height. But anyway, here it's very high density. And that particular place is a bit mixed use because some of these buildings are largely commercial. Some of them are just offices. There also are hotels, but some are also residential, where the ground floors, if they are not the main lobbies of the residences, they would have some commercial establishments located there too. Okay, so here is the case of a contrast in a single-use area. Here, this largely residential area. And over there in the distance is a mixed-use district. This has some very important implications. For one thing, if you notice, if you look at this single-use residential area, it spreads out. And it's largely residential. which means that to go from your residence to, say, your office, or even to do shopping, to go to school, would require a long distance. So if there's no mass transit system, it would require the use of private vehicles on a daily basis. Okay. In contrast, if you have a dominantly mixed-use city, here's an example of a city block in New York, and it's mixed use. And in this instance, it's about medium density. The buildings here have about 4 floors. The ground floor would be largely commercial. The upper floors are all residential. So very many people actually live above what is basically a commercial district. And it would mean that for many, from their place of residence to the place where they can shop or buy things, they just need to walk. And there's a possibility that their place of work could also be just walking distance. And walking is very much encouraged because among the things you notice, they have a very, very wide sidewalk. Okay? They have a very wide sidewalk to encourage a lot of people to use it. Okay? Hindi yan tulad dito sa Pilipinas, lalo sa Metro Manila. A lot of the sidewalks are disappearing to make way for private vehicles. So even for people who would prefer to take public transport like myself, the problem with a public transport commuter is that a public transport commuter is always a pedestrian. Okay? You need to walk from your place of origin to the place where you can get the vehicular ride, and then your vehicular ride stops at a certain distance from where you are going, and then you might also need to walk. So it's essential for public transit commuters to have wide space as a pedestrian. Okay, but that's disappearing here. There's no appreciation of the fact that if you're going to construct more trains like what they're doing right now, and then also that they are trying to, they say, rationalize the bus systems and the like, they are completely forgetting the need for wider sidewalks so that pedestrians could actually move very easily from the trains to the bus or just to walk to their actual destination. Okay, now we'll be discussing that in greater detail next week when I talk about housing and transport. Now, when we're not talking about land price, okay, land price is a function of distance from the center, where the city center is regarded as the most desirable location. Okay. Now, the area of a circle, A, is equal to pi r squared, where r is the radius from the midpoint to the edge of the circle. Okay, so the entire area of a circle is pi r squared, which approximates the entire area of a city or of a metropolitan area. Okay, so using this particular geometric form, it is said that in a city, a household, a firm, would trade off the land price and the transport cost in terms of whether to locate in the city center or not. For firms, okay, if they locate in the city center, they might need to pay higher wages, but they would have a much larger and a more diverse labor supply. That's one of the effects of urbanization economies. Okay, the labor market cooling. At the same time, for firms, if they locate nearer the center, they'd have to end up paying higher rent, but there's a much larger market in the city center. There are more people who go to the city center. Okay, so these are the things that the firms trade off in terms of their desirable location. For households, the issue is the same. If they locate near the city center, then they could have a lower transport cost, but there's a much higher cost for housing, whether for rental or for purchase. And that's why for very many who live near the center, halimbawa doon sa Pasig o sa BGC o sa Makati and the like, you might end up in very, very small apartments because that's just about what you can afford. Now, in contrast, if one were to live a bit of a distance from the city center towards the suburb, okay, you can get a larger house with a plot of land around it, your own garden around it, but there'd be a much higher transport cost moving from your house to the city center and back. Okay. Now, here is an illustration of the relationship between distance and land price. Because of the nature of a circle, the further away from the center that one is located, the lower the price is, and therefore the lower is the rental cost of land. But the relationship between rent and distance is not a straight line, because A equals pi r squared, the relationship between rent and distance is more parabolic. The price of land, the rental, decreases very rapidly nearer the center of the city. Okay? And once it's a bit of a distance, it decreases much more slowly, and then it gets to diminish further. Okay? If there were another city located, say, a couple of kilometers beyond this 10-kilometer edge, then rental prices will begin to increase further. But what will happen is, in this particular area, from the 5 kilometers onwards, because the rental is so low, it's possible that some of these lands can be farmland, can be open space, because the next city center is a bit of a distance away. Right? Now, if cities are monocentric, what will happen here is that the activities are arranged by transport cost. There's a much higher transport cost closer to the center. I would say that, for example, a city like Butuan would be more monocentric. It is largely on its own. It's a bit of a long distance from the nearest large city, which I guess would be Surigao and Hingoo. Now, in this particular sense of a monocentric city, in the center, you'd have the offices there, where the office work is done by the higher cost office worker. Manufacturing does not need to be done in the city center. It can be done in the outer edges where land prices are cheaper. Okay? And manufacturing can be transported by trucks, which from the off-center towards the center, since the actual manufacturing activity would be located a bit of a distance from the center where land prices are much lower. However, most employment would be concentrated in the center since the commuting cost is lower there than the cost of transport for out. Now, if it's a multi-centric city, which would be the case for large cities, okay, then there's a good deal of suburbanization, right? Now, transport development would contribute to the suburbanization of manufacturing employment. Once they had constructed the North Expressway and the South Expressway in the early 1970s, there were a lot of manufacturing establishments that moved from the center of Metro Manila towards Bulacan and towards Laguna and Cavite. Okay? Trucks reduced the freight cost, and it therefore allowed manufacturing to move to the suburbs. And most manufacturing jobs would hire workers that are willing to earn less than those in the higher managerial positions. And because they have lower earnings, they would tend to afford living in the suburbs. Now, for cities where there are airports, okay, air freight, okay, would also have increased uh, activities in those places located near the airports. With the expressways, then it opened the possibility of more mobility for private vehicles and also for mass transit vehicles like buses and the like. So it therefore allowed for suburban living. So for people who could live in the suburbs and then they just travel to the center of the city. And that's why you have developments in the suburbs of Metro Manila and right outside. Okay. Alabang, for example, was farmland until the 1980s. But with the development of the expressway, it allowed for a high-income residential area to be developed there. And not far from that, you have the BF homes, which are more middle income. And both of these types of housing were made possible by the availability of a transport link to the city center over in Makati, okay, with the South Expressway. Eastwood, for example, that used to be textile mills. Okay? Uh, that used to be General Textiles, owned by the Picache family, whose most famous member is Cherry Pie. Okay. Now, given its location, uh, the textile mills would be relocated to the industrial estates in Laguna, and many of them have closed already since they've lost their comparative advantage to imported textiles from China. So with that particular area no longer a manufacturing site, it became viable as a mixed-use urban development site. So it's a commercial center and also high-end residential area. Okay? So these are the factors that would encourage suburbanization and therefore the development of polycentric cities. Okay, you would have a decrease in commuting costs that will increase the accessibility of locations which are a bit of a distance from the city center. Many higher income households would much prefer to be located to the suburbs because they would see they were trying to avoid problems that are peculiar to city centers, such as deteriorating housing and environment, crime, and the like. A characteristic of city centers is that they tend to be the older parts of the cities. And in Metro Manila, that city center would be the city of Manila. Okay, with the deterioration of the city center from 1960s and 70s, more and more moved towards Makati. Makati was originally developed as a suburb. Okay? So that's why it had those low density residential areas that were gated, closed. That was still the edge of the city. It was a suburb. But over time, more and more of the residents moved towards Makati. And not only that, even corporate headquarters and the financial institutions decided to move to Makati with the greater deterioration of the city centers of Manila. Okay? Plus the fact that you'd have the improvement in highways and road links from the city of Manila towards Quezon City and towards Makati. Okay? And employment opportunities have therefore been suburbanized. Where they used to be concentrated there in the city of Manila, they are now available in Makati. And then you have the expansion of the central business district to go towards Ortigas, and then towards BGC and to several spots in Quezon City as well. Now, another factor when it comes to suburbanization is the fact that commuting could very well be underpriced. By the way, the word commute has a peculiar meaning in Taglish or Filipinish. When Filipinos use the word commute, it means to travel in public transport. Okay? In the English language, commute is to travel on a regular daily basis, whether it is on public transport or your own private vehicle. Okay? So a commuter is one for whom daily travel on a vehicle is part of his or her work and lifestyle. Okay? It's essential for this person to ride the vehicle from the place of residence to the place of work and back daily, whether the vehicle be his own private vehicle or the use of public transport. Now, it's said that commuting would be underpriced in that if you're using your private vehicles, you are causing pollution and you're also causing congestion. More and more vehicles using the same road space, causing congestion. Since the pricing of the use of public vehicles or even public transit systems does not incorporate the cost of congestion and pollution, then people would just happily commute from the city center to the suburbs where they live and back. The other reason why suburbanization happened, not just in the Philippines, but throughout the world, is that there would be a lack of metropolitan or central government planning. By metropolitan, it is the planning not just of the city, but of the immediately surrounding towns and cities that could be suburbanized. Okay? In some places, they have planned for this metropolitan development, but in others, they have not. And actually, you will find this interesting for your own research, that there have been metropolitan plans as early as the 1970s. Okay? And there have been several metropolitan plans. But as always, like many plans here in the Philippines, okay, the idea of a plan is to come up with a plan rather than for the plan to guide decision making. So that never really happened. For example, as early as the 1970s, they've already made some proposals about the establishment of a light rail transit system. Yung mga lines that you see right now, plus the proposed lines, were actually developed way back in the 1970s. And they started to implement them thoroughly only now. Okay. They were so planned back in the 1970s so that they could anticipate the growth in the suburban areas. Kaya nangyari, what's happening right now is that they're just simply trying to catch up with what happened in the metropolitan Manila area. Okay? And there still are a lot of existing plans. But okay, whether they will actually implement them or not is another issue, of course. Now, given that you have land uses, okay, it is actually possible. We're talking here about the lack of metropolitan or government planning. An important element in metropolitan or government planning would be how to deal with land use. Okay? And land use is often dealt with through what is known as zoning. Okay? Zoning is a deliberate action by government to designate what are admissible land uses and or density for different districts and the like. In other words, once you have a land use, okay, that's why I asked you kung ano yung ideal land use, if there's an ideal land use that was available for your city. Okay. In countries in Europe and in cities in Europe and North America, the desired land use can be attained first by zoning, where government actually determines the zones and what are the admissible uses there, and they go as far as determining the density, the heights of buildings, and the like. Okay. Here are different examples of zoning. Okay. They would have nuisance zoning, zoning rules that will decrease exposure to pollution, noise, and congestion and externalities. This zoning is done by determining that certain places would be, say, completely residential. Industrial activities and a list of other activities will not be allowed to be located there. Okay. Here in the Philippines, the ones that are very strict about this is not the local governments or the national government, but rather homeowners associations. And usually, these are the homeowners associations in the higher income residential developments. Kasi in the more middle income residential developments, okay, although supposedly residential, the next thing you know, you'd have a house there, meron na siyang karatula, she's a dentist, dental appointment, or dun sa isa, longganisa for sale. Okay, o bigla na lang meron ng sari-sari store. Okay? That now deviates from the area being residential. Some commercial enterprises are now happening. Okay. Now, if zoning were strict, these activities would not possibly happen. Okay. There are some of you here who it turns out live in condominium developments. Yan, tulad ni Jackie sa Pasig. I hope that your condominium managers or building managers do not allow people to the residents to sell longganisa or to provide barbecue or ihaw-ihaw from your residential units. Mahirap yan kasi fire hazard yan. Okay? Now, alternative types of zoning would be what is called performance zoning. Performance zoning is done very well in developed countries that have efficient and very high technology sensors. Okay, for example, this other type of nuisance zoning would not allow for noise levels above a certain decibel. Okay, so regardless if it's a vehicle, ayun, that is controlling the entry of vehicles in the area. Okay, lalo na kung masyadong maingay na pag marami ng mga sasakyan na dumadaan. Okay. Glare, I don't know if any of you have ever walked alongside Ayala Avenue in the afternoon, but we'll try to do it pag wala ng quarantine. There is a segment in Ayala Avenue toward that would be nearer the direction of the Yuchengco Tower. There's a long segment there na sa hapon napakainit because the afternoon sun is reflecting from the building across, which is all glass. I think it's what they call the GT Tower. Okay, so that's the case of glare. Okay. In some countries, they will not allow such things to happen. They're causing glare in the nearby buildings. I do not know how they were dealing that in Makati. Then also there's a control for odor. So you therefore try to make sure that industrial activities and dump sites are located far away from residential institutional activities. Institutional being schools, hospitals, religious places of worship, and the like. Okay? Another type of zoning has to do with regulations on smoke emissions. Then there's also parking and traffic zoning. Okay. In New York City, for example, parking is very, very expensive in Manhattan. Extremely expensive. So much so that people would not anymore bring their cars to the city center. This is trying to zone out the use of private cars for those who live in Manhattan, so that people would be more or less forced to just regularly use mass transit or walk. Okay. Now, in terms of zoning, of course, the problem with zoning is the cost of enforcement. How much does government need to spend to ensure that its zoning rules are actually being implemented, being enforced, and being followed? Okay. Some types of zoning are fiscal in nature. That's why I ask you, is the fiscal system in any way connected to the land use? And all of you said hindi. Okay? And in fact, ang nangyayari dun sa the land use is a function of how the owner states it to be. Okay? Now, in Europe and in the USA, so if there's an ideal land use, okay, then that ideal land use will end up being embodied in zoning rules. And one way of imposing the zoning rule is by way of the fiscal system. Anong ibig nitong sabihin? If you are in a district that has been zoned to be mixed use, where ground floors are all commercial, upper floors are residential, okay, as long as your establishment follows that land use, then your tax rate is at its lowest level. Okay? If you don't follow their ideal land use, then you will be made to pay a much higher rate. To a degree, some of you noticed in your own towns, like in sa Bacoor, and if I recall right, sa Parañaque and Pasig, you noticed that agricultural land has the highest tax rate, okay? Which seems to mean that those cities are discouraging the use of land in those cities for agricultural purposes. That is a form of fiscal zoning. Okay? But that seems to be the only one, because in most other cases, it's a question of what you say the land use happens to be and the government will follow. Okay? So that is one form of fiscal zoning. Okay? Now, some types of zoning would be exclusionary. Okay? Ito ginagawa ito sa mga high-end residential developments like sa Ayala Alabang, also sa Forbes Park, La Vista, and the like, okay? This is done, for example, also in Beverly Hills. For those who used to watch 90210, okay? 90210 is the zip code, the postal identification code for the city of Beverly Hills. Beverly Hills is an autonomous city in Los Angeles, meaning to say it is independent of the city of Los Angeles. Okay? Para yang imagine that Forbes Park, Dasmariñas Village, Urdaneta Village, Bel Air, and San Lorenzo all together decided to declare itself as being independent of Makati. Okay. That is allowed by the laws of California. So Beverly Hills decided to declare itself as autonomous of the entire city of Los Angeles. Okay. Ngayon, Beverly Hills does not say that to live there, you must have this certain minimum level of income. Rather, what they say is, if you want to purchase house in Beverly Hills, then there's a minimum lot size. And there is a minimum ratio of house to the lot. The ratio, I think, is 1:4, which means that only 20% of your lot may be used for housing construction. Everything else has to remain as open space. So effectively, this means that only the really, really high income people live there. And that's a form of exclusionary zoning. Okay? And that's the same rules being imposed by homeowners associations in Forbes Park, Ayala Alabang, um, Urdaneta, and the like. Okay? It's really to keep out the riffraff. Occasionally, some of the riffraff would be like Manny Pacquiao, but what can they do? But he is an exception, right? Mm-mm. Balita ko nung nagreklamo yung mga taga Forbes Park kasi si Mami Jonesia ay nagdala ng ABS-CBN television crew. And of course, the people who live there because they don't want to be bothered by the rest of the world. And then here you are, the television crew with their cameras they could easily catch videotapes of the nearby residences. Kaya nagkakaroon ng issue about that. Okay. Now, a type of inclusionary zoning is that there are laws or rules which require that whenever you have a housing development, any housing development, but most especially if it's a high-end housing development, that there's 20% of the units that will be set aside for low income or for low-cost housing. Okay. So what will happen is that in this particular area, you would have a mix of households from high income to those of low and middle income, which is actually very important as we'll be discussing next week or maybe the week after. It's one of those topics that I decided not to require before I found out na we are actually working on a semestral, not a quarterly basis. But what I mean to say is that in cities, a lot of the jobs for middle and low income people are service type of jobs which are provided by high income households, such as domestic service and the like. So if you have low income households that can live not far away from where the high income households are, then they can easily fill in those job requirements of high income households. Which is why whenever there is a low income or low cost housing development that is mandatory, whenever you have a high end residential development, it's a form of inclusionary zoning. You include the low income rather than sending him away, which large lot zoning would do. So here is an example of your land use map for San Juan, Luna, and Calanipa, which is over in Panay, okay? And if you notice here, this is a barangay, but a large area, this yellow, okay, was zoned to be residential. And because it's very large, then you realize that these are for low density housing, meaning to say these are all for house and lots. And given the distance, these are the sorts of residential developments that will encourage daily private vehicle commuting. Okay, and many of these large lots, large areas, would end up actually being developed for the higher income households of this particular community. Now here, on the lower photo, you have a high density mixed use development, which is in Singapore, where the units from the second floor all the way to the top are all residential. And the ground floor, you have them as commercial establishments, okay? And there could very well be a public park. When a lot of city dwellers, okay, live in very small confined spaces like these uh, high-rise developments, like in Singapore. A public park becomes a necessity because that's the only access that many of the residents here would have to nature, to having their own backyard. The public park becomes their own backyard. Okay? That's the reason why in so many films about New York City, there is a certain attachment that people have to Central Park. Because most of the people living in Manhattan actually live in condominium developments. They all live in apartments in several floors above the street level. Their only opportunity to enjoy nature and to have the semblance of having your own yard would be to go to a park like Central Park. Sa atin dito sa Metro Manila sa Pilipinas, we still have not developed that. However, if you notice, when they imposed quarantine rules and the like, in many informal settlements, okay, they were forcing people to go back inside their houses. The thing is, you see, their houses in the informal settlements are small and confined. It was necessary for them to go out into the public spaces just so that they can enjoy a bit of open air. And now they had to be asked to go back inside their own homes. Okay? This open space requirement is not yet very, very well appreciated here. Right now, what we have in the upper photo would be the case of a private residential development. It's low density. Each particular housing unit has its own yard and therefore its own garden. So the entire district is full of trees. It has a semblance of a forest, and yet a lot of this open space is actually private. Okay. Another type of zoning, one which is not very well appreciated here in the Philippines, but it's the reason why, when so many go to cities in Europe and they say, ang ganda-ganda ng mga syudad nila and the like, ang papangit ng syudad nila dito. Kasi doon, part of the zoning rules is the design. Okay? They do impose rules on the design of buildings. And the design here refers not just to the engineering design, but through the ornamental architectural features. Okay? So by imposing design rules, okay, they design even infrastructure. They design their subway stations, their train stations. Ang gaganda ng design ng mga train stations nila. That's why for many who take the trains, who take the buses and the like, it's a very pleasant experience kasi maganda ang design ng bus stops, maganda ang design ng bus terminals, maganda ang design ng train stations and the like. Tayo dito sa Metro Manila, dito sa Pilipinas, gusto nating pumunta sa mga malls kasi maraming malls magagandang design. Pero wala sa ating gustong pumunta halimbawa sa mga bus terminal or sa mga ferry terminals. Hindi maganda yung design nila. They're very, very utilitarian. For that matter, the LRT stations. Okay? One superlative example of design is the case of Paris. Sa Paris, in the city center, their zoning goes as far as determining the height of the building. That's one of the reasons why magandang pumunta doon kasi buildings have the same height. That's a rule. And not only should the buildings have the same height, every floor should also have the same height. Okay? So they determine the heights of the ceilings of every floor. And all the buildings have to follow that. So what it does is that it creates a certain image for the entire city. Okay? Nagkakaroon ng design features para dyan sa syudad. Okay? Kaya nga pag sinasabing romantic city daw ang Paris and the like, alam nyo, for a city to be romantic, then you have to know what romance is like. Ano ibig sabihin ng romance? You're both trying to get to know each other. And what it's like to try to get to know each other, di ba? Nakaka-tense, nakaka-nervyos. So what do? You try to relieve your stress, your tension, your nervousness in getting to know each other. How? By walking. So that's why if a city has wide pedestrian lanes, then there's greater opportunity for couples to walk. And then kung maganda pa yung mga buildings, may mapag-uusapan kayo. Okay, you can talk about how beautiful this building is. Tapos may estatwa pa dyan. You have something to talk about. So after some time, ayan, napagod na kayo sa kalalakad and like, you're more relaxed in each other. Ayun, yan ang romantic city. Okay. Hindi pwede yan dito sa Metro Manila kasi ang kikitid ng mga pedestrian spots. Kung pumunta ka sa malls, ang kikitid din, ang dami ng mga tao, hindi kayo pwede magkwentuhan. Okay? Mamaya habang nagkwekwento-kwentuhan kayo, bigla na lang may lalapit siya, "Hi ma'am, sir, sale po dito." Kaya walang romance dito. It's far too congested. Okay? Yan. So what's the impact of land use and zoning? Okay, the land use will have an impact on the transport situation in the city. When you have single use districts, it will tend to sprawl. Then there will be a need for regular commuting, whether the commuting be by private vehicles or by mass transit. As opposed to higher density mixed use, it will make it possible for more people to just walk from their place of residence to place of work, place of shopping, and the like. Property tax administration can be more efficient kasi may ideal land use, and therefore the tax rates are pegged at their lowest rates if your particular building follows the ideal land use. Okay? And if it does not, then you pay a much higher rate, which will be penalizing you. So you're forced to actually follow the ideal land use for that particular area. Land use and zoning will also have an impact on housing. It will make it possible whether low-income housing would be available in the city centers or if they are located so far away. And then you'll have a problem here of transport access. Okay? And if you have very strict land use and zoning, it can have an effect on the design aesthetic and the image of your city. One reason kung bakit overall hindi maganda ang mga syudad natin dito sa Pilipinas, kasi nga wala naman tayong design zoning. Kung may kagandahan man, it's usually in privately developed centers. Halimbawa sa BGC, doon sa Ayala, sa Makati, and the like. But outside of that, wala kang makikitang magandang design. Okay? Now, so I'll now introduce you then to the issue here of property taxation. Unless there are any questions for the moment. Tingnan ko nga yung chat. Wala namang nagtatanong. Okay. When you're talking about property taxation, okay, the local government would have its own tax and expenditure policies. The difference between a national and a local government is that the local government is more like a club, meaning to say, its tax and expenditure policies are directed mainly to the residents of the city. Okay? So it's like you're part of the club. If you're not a club member, then you cannot avail of those tax and expenditure arrangements. Okay. When you talk of government economic policies, economics, you do have stabilization policies. Yan ang kinuha nyo sa macroeconomics. Okay? You have your fiscal and monetary policies and exchange rate policies. Those are generally national government.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
Sir, is there a PPT flash po? Is there a PowerPoint flashed in the screen?
Hindi niyo nakikita?
Hindi po, sir. Land use pa din po.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yun na. Nakita niya types of government economic policy?
Wala pa din po, sir.
Okay. Just a minute. I will screen share. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
You see it na?
Yes po.
Okay, good. Thank you. Right. So you have stabilization policy. These are best done by the national government. Then you have income redistribution policies. Okay. Income redistribution policies would be the most straightforward one, using 4Ps, where low-income households are given a cash grant conditional on children being given immunizations, vaccinations, and attending elementary school regularly. Okay, but there are other income redistribution policies, such as government using its tax revenues to finance public education, public healthcare, and as far as low-income housing. Some of these could be done by the national government, some can be done by the local government. Okay? Itong si Yorme has already announced he'll start constructing medium density housing for the informal settlements in Manila. That would be a local government initiative at income redistribution. Okay. Now, resource allocation, especially if it's area specific, is more efficiently undertaken by a local government. Now, the given the tendency of neoclassical analysis to actually emphasize the importance of perfectly competitive markets, okay, there are, however, well-established justification for government involvement in resource allocation issues. Okay. One is that some activities are natural monopolies. So it is argued that a natural monopoly is best provided for or regulated by a government agency, whether national or local. Then you have activities that would have an externality by government being involved there. It can allow externalities to be internalized. Okay? Then, of course, there are public goods which are non-rival in consumption, which therefore means they are most efficiently, optimally provided for by a government that can impose tax on people so that they can pay their fair share of these public goods and not be free riders. Okay. And there's a certain efficiency of local governments in terms of providing for what are called local goods. Now, when you talk about natural monopolies, natural monopolies are those that involve production that's subject to relatively large-scale economies because of very high fixed cost and small marginal cost. Mass transit is said to be a natural monopoly. Okay? Hindi siya socially optimal when it involves perfect competition. Bakit? Perfect competition, as you know, is premised on four things. You have one homogeneous good, you have many buyers and sellers such that no one can control the price. You have resource mobility, meaning to say resources are generally available in case there's a sudden increase in demand. So therefore producers can automatically obtain the resources to increase production to meet the increase in demand. And then you have perfect information. Okay? There's information as to where a good is available at what particular price. Mass transit in cities, okay, do not have resource mobility. There is one very, very important resource, and that's road space. And road space in cities would be limited. That's why it is said that mass transit is most socially optimal if it is being administered by the government. And that's the reason why we have a suboptimal mass transit system here in the Philippines kasi ginagawang perfectly competitive. So all of those jeeps and buses are actually using the same road space to compete for riders. And that's why you have what is called traffic congestion. Okay? Kasi hindi lang yan, they tend to concentrate in what are seen as the most profitable routes. Kaya ang daming mga kalye, hindi na nila dinadaanan. Kasi yun na nga, wala daw masyadong sasakay dun. They could not make any earnings from those particular routes. So you have certain routes being a concentration of all these jeeps, buses, PUVs, and the like. And therefore, these particular routes are the ones which suffer from tremendous traffic congestion. Okay? Ngayon, in most developed cities, okay, mass transit is a government monopoly. Okay, so bus drivers, train conductors, all of them are given a fixed salary. So their buses leave at a certain point, they make regular stops, whether may sumakay, whether may bumaba, they will always stop and then they go. Okay? Kasi their salary has nothing to do with the number of passengers they're able to attract, which is not the case with our jeeps and buses. Okay, but I'll discuss that more next week. Another type of a natural monopoly is water distribution and electric power distribution. You have economies of scale to whoever would be the first to put in the water pipes and the electric power lines and also the landlines for telecommunications and the like. And that's why it is said that these are all natural monopolies. Okay, and therefore government intervention in these activities is seen to be justified. Okay? So government can either directly provide it or they will contract a private firm and regulate the firm. Water distribution in Metro Manila, for example, has been contracted to private firms Maynilad and Manila Water. Okay? And in fact, the World Bank has always used the Metro Manila privatization of water distribution as a model for privatization efforts throughout the world. Okay. Now, whether the national or local government would be the ones involved in natural monopolies is a question on the extent of scale economies. Dito sa Metro Manila, there is no Metro Manila government, which means that water distribution, electric power distribution, and the like, the scale is much bigger than one city in Metro Manila. So it ends up being a national government responsibility. Had there been a Metro Manila government, it can be passed on by the national government to the Metro Manila government. Eh, walang ganyan. Okay? I would presume that in Butuan, these things can be dealt with by the city of Butuan. No need for the provincial government of Agusan to be involved there. Now you have externality. Okay? Externality is defined as an action that creates benefits and costs to others. So an externality, therefore, causes a divergence between the private cost benefit and the social cost benefit. If governments were to be involved, then it will allow for the internalization of externalities. For example, there's supposed to be an externality when the labor force in general is educated. It causes overall improvements in productivity in society. Therefore, government would be justified in providing for public educational facilities. Okay? Pollution and sanitation would be issues of externalities. You can have firms that might be dumping their wastes or producing pollution and not being penalized by it. Okay? So if government were to be involved, they will impose on these firms requirements such that they take care of reducing the waste that they generate and the pollution that they're creating. Okay. Then you have the issue of public goods. Public goods are goods that are non-rival in consumption. Now, a local public good or a club good is a public good, but it is subject to congestion. So the benefits of a local public good would be confined to a small geographic area. An example of a local good is a swimming pool. Okay? You have a swimming pool and you're using it. In principle, you cannot stop others from using it as well. Okay? Problems emerge when there are too many people in the swimming pools. Okay? Which is why, to be really, really optimal, okay, they will restrict on the users of the pool. So it becomes therefore restricted to members of the club, or if it's a publicly financed swimming pool, only to city residents. Okay? Dito sa Marikina, there is a public pool sa Rodriguez Sports Center where the use is restricted to residents of Marikina. Okay? Public parks, these are also examples of local public goods, especially since a park may not necessarily be able to accommodate all the people in a large city, but definitely in the small city where it's located, it can be enjoyed by the residents of that particular city. Okay? Dito sa Marikina, meron ditong public park which is actually the riverbanks of Marikina. The banks have been developed as open space and as a public park. Okay? Now, local governments are said to be more efficient in providing for local goods if there's much greater diversity in demand. For example, like public parks. Lots of people of different income levels would be able to enjoy a public park. Then also sports facilities. People from different social classes would enjoy the use of available sports facilities, especially if there are many different sports facilities made available. Okay. Local governments would also said to be more efficient if the externality is smaller, meaning to say that the impact, the outside impact is confined. So that will be the case of a public park, where the benefits of that will be confined to those living not too far away from this particular park, Okay? And when the scale of operation is small, like a public bus service, as opposed to an urban rail transit, like the LRT or MRT, okay, a national government or a larger government would be more efficient as compared to a one city and the like. Okay? Now, to finance government activities, usually the property tax is the one that finances local government. Okay? Property tax could be a tax on land, can also be a tax on improvements made in the land, such as the buildings and the like. Okay? Sa assignments ninyo, you noted na may assessment level, in which case the tax rate is applied on the assessed value, where the assessed value is a certain percentage of the market value. Okay. Now, actually, in other countries, if they don't have assessed value and the tax is computed based on the actual market value, the tax rates are actually much smaller. So it's possible that whether you have an assessed value or no assessed value whatsoever, the actual tax due might end up being more or less the same. Okay? So yung assessed value dito is just a percentage of the market value. Pero mas mataas yung tax rate compared to those where the tax rate is on the entire market value. Okay? Now, If a government has a certain ideal land use, it can realize that land use if the tax rate is integrated with the ideal land use. Meaning to say, halimbawa, ideal land use, this particular area is mixed use and dapat medium density, meaning to say, it's commercial on the ground floor, residential in the upper floors, and minimum 5 stories. Okay? For as long as your structure follows these land use rules and you pay the lowest rate, then the ideal land use can be realized. Now, what if in that particular area you have a residential unit that's only 2 floors? It doesn't follow the mixed use medium density. You'll still be allowed to be there, but you pay a very, very high rate. Okay? That is what's called a punitive rate. So what will happen is you'll be forced to end up constructing a 5-story building with commercial in the ground floor, residential in the upper floors. So that's what I mean when I say that property tax system can actually help realize the ideal land use if the property tax system is integrated with the ideal land use. Right? Now, the thing about land use and the property taxes and the like is that the nature of land, especially in urban areas, is that you have multiple demands. There are many demands for a particular property at the center of the city. Okay? There is a certain supply fixity. Okay? The amount of land in the center of the city is actually restricted. There's only so much. And the space there can be used for a variety of things. They can be for a public park. They can be for a public building. They can be for the construction of a high-rise building. Okay? And this, in fact, is the problem faced by old buildings, heritage structures, which are located in the center of the city. Okay? There's a demand to maintain them as heritage structures, to maintain the city's own history, the architectural history of the city. But there's also a demand for that particular location because they tend to be located in the center of the city. Therefore, there's a demand to purchase that land, to demolish the old building, and to construct high-rise buildings. Okay, so that's why you have multiple demands on land, and that's a function of value. Okay, there's a function of value. There are very, very many different values actually. When people have a demand for something, it's because that something has a value. And that value is related to a certain type of use. And when it comes to land, it is in the land use. Okay, the various uses of land has values. The most common types of values would be extractive use value, non-extractive recreational, non-extractive aesthetic, and non-use value. Okay. Extractive use value is the type of use value that is assumed in microeconomic analysis, especially in demand. It is essentially consumption use value. Okay? So that's why when you're hungry and you have a demand for a hamburger and you eat it, yun ang extractive use. You are trying to extract the juiciness, the flavor of the burger to satisfy your hunger. Yun ang consumption use value. That's the extractive use value. When it comes to land, when it comes to natural resources, okay, this is the case where the asset provides goods and services that can be extracted or harvested from the site. For example, mangroves have an extractive use value. If you cut those mangroves, nawala na yung mangroves, yeah, but you can now use the space that was occupied by the mangrove swamp for a reclamation project. Okay? Meron sa inyong taga Parañaque, I recall, And part of what the city plans to do is to do reclamation on the shore. That's an extractive use value. They will have to extract any swamp there or any coral reef and then start dumping land there to create land. So that's an example of extractive use value. As you notice, itong extractive use value na ito, although it creates land, it destroys the mangrove swamps or the coral reefs. Okay? But another type of use value is non-extractive, where the asset provides services without the need to extract or harvest any. Okay. So you have two general types of non-extractive use value. There's the recreational, there's the aesthetic. Okay. Recreational means that the asset provides leisure services. Halimbawa, if you have a mangrove swamp, okay, that mangrove there becomes the habitat for shellfish. So it allows for what you call this, fishing of more crabs, shrimps, and the like. Okay, mangroves also produce a sap that can be useful in processing vinegar. Kung may coral reefs naman, the corals themselves are an aesthetic experience, meaning to say you can develop tours where you have people paying to go around the coral reefs. They could go snorkeling and the like just to have a look at the coral reefs. Okay, so there's beauty in the coral reefs, so it's aesthetic. So for those who don't want to go as far as scuba diving, they can see the coral reefs. There's also the recreational use value, meaning to say that the coral reefs precisely are good, attractive places to do snorkeling, scuba diving, and some small-scale fishing. Okay, so the same coral reefs and mangroves that have an extractive use value would also have a non-extractive use value. Okay, where it could also generate earnings, could also be profitable. But there's also a non-use value. Okay? A non-use value is one where human beings would want the asset to continue to exist. Okay? There's the option value, where some people are willing to donate funds to maintain a particular asset because someday they would like to see it. Okay? For example, you have people who are willing to donate to keep the whales in existence. Okay, save the whale because someday they might want to go whale watching. But there's also the quasi-option value. Some people will find the continued existence of whales worthwhile, even though they don't want to see them. I, for one, don't want to see whales. It means I'll have to board the ships or boats and go to the open sea and the like and just see them. Rather than watch whales, I'd rather just swim in the sea. But there's the quasi-option value. Even though I don't want to see them, it's always nice to contribute to make sure that they still are in existence. So notice you have four different values. The extractive use value. You have non-extractive, recreational, and aesthetic. Then you have the non-use value. There are also values like symbolic value, historical value, heritage value. The point here is that there are multiple values attached to land and its location, which translates to increasing demand. Okay, so that's why the value of land in the city center goes up very, very rapidly because it reflects different demands for that same property. Okay, and as my favorite topic in urban analysis which is your analysis of what to do with old buildings or old houses in a particular district. Old buildings and old houses are located in centers of the city. Okay, they have a certain value to them. Some of them are still beautiful, so they can be restored and they can be converted say restaurants, clubs, and the like. They also have what is called a historic and heritage value because they are a connection to a city's specific history, its architectural history, and the history of that particular location. But the site where it is located has an extractive use value. If that site, you can remove that building, then you can construct a high-rise building there. So that's why the value of that property can go up unless there is a property tax system where the property tax would provide, say, a lower tax rate to an old building which is being preserved, and all the maintenance costs are deducted from the taxable value. Okay. In that case, it can happen that the non-extractive use value can dominate over the extractive use value. So, if you therefore look at the city of Manila here, there is its general street map and the map for major landmarks. Okay, but the land use would look like this. Okay, this is the official zoning map, but they have not really followed it very strictly. Yung Torre de Manila, had they followed this land use map, the Torre de Manila would never have been constructed because in that particular area that was zoned as a heritage district with low to medium density structures. But somehow, the zoning ordinances always allow mayors to provide exceptions. Yun, nagbigay ng exceptions yung era. Okay? And then the Supreme Court said, well, sorry, the laws naman do not specifically say na the land use has to be followed because the law simply said that the land use is just a guide. It's not mandatory. Here's another example of a land use. Ito yung sa reclamation area. Okay. And you will notice again, reclaim ng lupa, there isn't any deliberate thought to provide for parks or open space. They are all mostly for structural development. Okay? Ang open space, halos nandun lamang sa shoreline. Okay? And I don't know if they're going to construct an artificial beach there para naman daw may mapuntahan ng mamamayan. And this is the original land use of the BGC area. The thing to note about this was that itong BGC used to be forest. Fort Bonifacio yan, forest yan. And that's why when it was developed like this, there was a lot of, a lot of disappointment because we're actually losing open space. We're losing forest, but they developed it. And the interesting thing here to note is this. BGC is located within the vicinity, within the jurisdiction of Taguig. In this particular area, originally, this was meant to be the civic center, meaning to say that's where the city government buildings should be located. You know, what makes a city a capital city is that the national government buildings are all located there. Kaya pag sinasabing London is the capital city, the national government buildings are all located there sa Westminster City or in Washington, D.C., which means for many government people, from the highest to the lowest, it's very easy for them to go around and have some interdepartmental meetings and the like. Dito sa atin, there is no clear location for the national government. We do have Manila as the capital city. The one important office that still is in Manila is the president, the residence in Malacanang, and the Supreme Court. But Congress, the lower house is over in Batasan, sa Quezon City. The Senate is way down in Pasay. And the Supreme Court plans to move to BGC. And government departments are spread from Manila all the way to Quezon City. Kaya nakakalat national government. Kaya wala tayong civic center. The closest that we have to a civic center is the Luneta towards the post office area. Pag civic center, that means that's where the national government buildings are located. Okay. Sa Taguig, dapat yung civic center nila nandito. Ano na siya ngayon? Ayan, SM Aura. So somehow, the city of Taguig thought it was much cheaper to just develop a new building on the same spot where the city hall is located. And the spot that was reserved for them, ayun, I don't think they sold it on a freehold. It was sold on a leasehold. Napunta sa SM Aura. Okay. So I end tonight's lecture here unless there are any questions. Sandali lang. Tapos na ito. Stop sharing. Okay. Okay, any questions? Teka muna. Okay. How do I unmute you? Okay, any questions from anyone? Okay, so your assignment is in preparation for next week, which is on housing and transport. To my understanding, your examination would be on the 21st of October. Okay, so it will involve your writing essays. Andiyan na yung mga review questions. The questions will be available from 6 p.m. of October 21st until 8 p.m. And they all have to be submitted by 8 p.m. October the 21st. So it will appear dun sa canvas ng Urban. And then you'll be writing your essays there and submitting them. Okay, so that will be 21st of October. Next week is our lecture on housing and transport. So the last lecture, so October 28th, is again the optional topic on urban poverty. And I'll be discussing your proposed research papers. Okay. So if there are no, yes, Mr. C, you're raising your hand.
No, sir. I just thumbs up.
Oh, so anyone else? Okay, so I'll see you next week. Right. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
It's
sir.
my
Thank you,
pleasure.
Thank you,
sir.
sir. Thank you,
Good
sir.
night. And thank you for taking my class. Okay.
Thank you po.
Night. I'll end this now. Okay. Bye-bye.